Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. When people argue in favor of the biblical flood, they tend to overlook the short narrative casually placed before the flood story in Genesis 6. We find a few verses about the sons of God having relations with human women. When men began to increase on earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw how beautiful the daughters of men were, and took wives from among those that pleased them. Genesis 6, 1-2. God intervenes and denies immortality to the offspring of these unions, and pronounces that their lives, like those of humans, will be limited to 120 years. This contamination between the upper and lower worlds provokes God to erase humankind from the face of the earth. But the flood does not put an end to these boundary-crossing events, since the sons of God will continue to come to the daughters of men and produce children, being the Nephilim, mighty heroes, the giants. It was then, and later too, that the Nephilim appeared on earth, when the sons of God cohabited with the daughters of men, who bore them offspring. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown. Genesis 6 verse 4. This story is not unique to the Bible, and the Bible is definitely not the first place such a story is mentioned. The myths of the coupling of the sons of God with mortal women come from mythological traditions that were widespread in ancient cultures. In some Canaanite and Ugaritic tablets and literature dating back to the 13th and 12th centuries BC, they tell how the father of the gods, El, had relations with two human women and produced the sons of God, Shakar and Shalim, who became gods themselves and joined the pantheon. In Greek mythology, written by the poet Hesiod around 700 BC, we have the tale of the Greek gods Zeus, the father of the gods, having relations with mortal women, and fathering Hercules, who ultimately gains divine status and immortality. In mythology, Zeus had many sexual encounters with mortal women. There are a great number of examples when the relationship between gods and mortals ended in marriage. These include Dionysus, the Greek god of grape harvest and winemaking, Tithonus and Eos, the Greek goddess of the dawn, and Psyche and Eros from Roman mythology, the god of sexual love. These stories were familiar to the biblical authors, but the Bible, the manifesto of the monotheistic revolution, could not easily embrace such pagan traditions. At the same time, biblical writers felt unable to ignore the stories, since doing so would allow them to continue to circulate unhindered. Instead, the Bible trod an intermediary path by telling the story in such a way that, while preserving most of the elements of the ancient tale, allowed a believer in one God to feel comfortable. The Genesis story lacks so much detail, as though the writer was unwilling to elaborate. Thus, attempts to fill the gaps in the post-biblical literature that were rejected by the writers of Genesis in their determination to throw out, or at least curtail, references to the heavenly beings, lust for mortal women. The Bible has a monotheistic agenda and could not accept the sons of God to be referred to in the same context of the pre-biblical pagan myths, thus sought to change the narrative. The designation Beni Elohim refers simply to gods, to members of the divine pantheon as used in Psalms 29 and Job 1 verse 6. This relationship between God and God's attendants could be found in Psalms 29, which calls on the divine attendants to praise and serve God. Some early interpreters of Genesis 6 explicitly identified the sons of God as angels, thus distancing themselves from the polytheistic God concept. In 1 Enoch 6 verse 3, "And the angels, the sons of heaven, saw them, daughters of men, and desired them." And in a number of manuscripts of the Septuagint, where sons of God in our story has been replaced with angels of God. The change in the meaning of the expression Beni Elohim, which lowered the being's status in order to conform to a belief in one God, removed one of the more significant obstacles blocking the myth's admittance into the Hebrew Bible. Another text to distance the Bible's version of the myth is when God sets a finite lifespan from the offspring of the divine mortal unions to 120 years, thus preventing them from inheriting their father's immortality, one of the characteristics of divinity. While immortality will not be inherited, one paternal trait is nonetheless passed on. The offspring are giants, the Nephilim. The physical description of the Nephilim fits with parallel traditions about the heavenly origins of Hercules and Samson. It becomes clear that Genesis 6, 1-4, the Bible's version of an ancient oral tradition about God's having intimate relations with women, did not succeed in cleansing the tale of its mythological roots. This failure is what stands behind the further interpretation of Beni Elohim as mortal judges, an interpretation that developed already in the biblical period and was recorded within the Bible's pages. The ancient pre-biblical story was stronger than both its rewritten version in Genesis and its other biblical interpreters. It returned along various paths and finally resurfaced in a post-biblical literature, long after monotheism had become well established. And tales such as this one about God's descending to earth and seducing the most beautiful of the human women could no longer pose any real threat. We will continue to explore more Bible stories and their mythological origins. Thank you.